Here's a number that doesn't make sense until you really think about it. 600,000 men marching into Russia in 1812. 600,000. That's roughly the population of modern-day Seattle or Glasgow or Dortmund. Now imagine all those people need to eat. Every single day. 3 times a day, ideally. They need water. They need shelter. They need shoes that don't fall apart. They need medical care when they get sick. They need their horses fed. They need ammunition. They need to know where they're going. Now imagine trying to organize all of that while walking 600 miles across a country with dirt roads, no railways, no telegraph, no refrigeration, and a population that's actively trying to starve you. That's the logistical challenge Napoleon faced in 1812. And here's the thing that makes this story so fascinating. He actually had a system that worked. Napoleon wasn't some reckless commander throwing bodies at a problem. He'd successfully supplied and moved armies across Europe for 15 years. He'd refined logistics to an art form. His system had won him an empire. So what went wrong in Russia? The simple answer is that almost everything killed Napoleon's army, except actual fighting. Battles accounted for maybe 50,000 deaths out of 580,000 total casualties. The rest died from typhus, dysentery, starvation, exposure, desertion, and simple exhaustion. They died because boots wore out, because bread didn't arrive, because water was contaminated, because no one could find the medical supplies. This is the unglamorous truth about one of history's most famous military disasters. It wasn't lost in some epic battle. It was lost in supply depots, field hospitals, broken wagon wheels, dead horses, and soldiers wandering off to find food and never coming back. In this video, you'll discover exactly how Napoleonic armies were supposed to feed themselves and why that system worked brilliantly in Austria and Prussia. You'll understand the specific mathematical problems of feeding 600,000 men daily across Russian distances. You'll learn which diseases killed the most soldiers and why sanitation collapsed so quickly. And you'll see how a cascading failure turned the largest army in European history into 20,000 starving survivors in 6 months. This isn't a story about tactics or battles. It's about the brutal reality that logistics, not generalship, determines who wins wars. Let's start with how it was supposed to work. Napoleon's logistical system wasn't revolutionary, but it was effective. It was based on a concept called living off the land, which sounds simple but required careful planning. The basic idea? Instead of bringing all your supplies with you, you take them from the territory you're marching through. Here's how it worked in practice. When Napoleon invaded Austria in 1805 or Prussia in 1806, his army would advance along multiple routes. Not one massive column, but several smaller corps spread across a front maybe 50 to 100 miles wide. Each corps, typically 20,000 to 30,000 men, would march through different towns and countryside. As they advanced, they'd requisition food from the local population. Requisition is a polite word for taking, but it was organized. Officers would arrange with local authorities to supply bread, meat, vegetables, wine, fodder for horses. Sometimes they paid, sometimes they just took it. But there was a system. The army would pass through an area, strip it of supplies, and keep moving, before they exhausted everything. This worked because Napoleon's earlier campaigns were in relatively wealthy, densely populated agricultural regions. Central Europe had good roads, prosperous farms, lots of towns. An army corps passing through could find enough food for a few days, then move on to the next area. The supply wagons that did follow the army carried ammunition, spare equipment, and emergency rations. But the bulk of daily food came from requisitioning. This made the army much faster and more mobile than if they had to bring everything with them. There were backup systems, too. Napoleon established supply depots at key cities behind his advance. If requisitioning failed in an area, wagons could bring food forward from these depots. He had a well-organized commissary system with officers responsible for tracking supplies and managing distribution. For water, armies would camp near rivers when possible. Soldiers would fill canteens from streams. Medical care came from mobile field hospitals that followed a few days behind the fighting troops. The brilliance of this system was its flexibility. Napoleon could move 200,000 men across 400 miles in 6 weeks because they weren't dragging an enormous supply train. The army was relatively light and fast, and it worked, repeatedly. The 1805 campaign against Austria took 2 months and was a logistical success. The 1806 Prussia campaign was even faster. The 1809 Austria campaign, again, the system held up. Napoleon's armies were generally well-fed, well-equipped, and capable of rapid movement. So when he planned the Russia invasion, he used the same model, with modifications, because he knew Russia was different. He spent a year building up massive supply depots in Poland. He assembled the largest supply train ever created, thousands of wagons carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies. He even brought portable ovens to bake bread. The plan was to advance quickly, maintain supply lines back to Poland, requisition what he could from Russian territory, and force a decisive battle within 8 weeks before logistics became a problem. On paper, it should have worked. What Napoleon didn't fully appreciate was that Russia broke every assumption his system depended on. First problem, distance. Napoleon's previous campaigns covered maybe 300 to 400 miles total. The march from the Polish border to Moscow was 600 miles, and the return journey obviously another 600 miles. That's not twice as hard as his previous campaigns. It's exponentially harder. Here's why. Imagine a supply wagon leaving a depot in Poland heading toward the army in Russia. The wagon, pulled by horses, can travel maybe 20 miles a day on good roads. To reach an army 300 miles away, that's 15 days of travel, then 15 days back, 1 month round trip. But Russian roads weren't good. They were dirt tracks that turned to mud when it rained. So maybe that wagon makes 10 miles per day, not 20. Now it's a 2-month round trip. And the horses pulling the wagon need to eat too. So the wagon has to carry food for the horses, as well as supplies for the army, which means less cargo space for actual military supplies. The math starts breaking down quickly. The farther the army advanced into Russia, the longer supply lines became. The more wagons were needed just to feed the horses pulling the wagons. At a certain distance, the whole system becomes pointless because the wagons consume more than they deliver. Napoleon knew this, which is why he planned to live off the land in Russia, just like he had in Austria. But Russia in 1812 wasn't Austria. Western Russia was relatively poor and sparsely populated compared to Central Europe. The farms were smaller, less productive. Towns were farther apart. There simply wasn't as much surplus food sitting around waiting to be requisitioned. And critically, the Russians implemented a scorched earth policy. As they retreated, they burned crops, destroyed food stores, drove away livestock. French troops would enter a town and find nothing. Empty granaries, burned fields, no cattle, no pigs, no chickens. The Russians had taken or destroyed everything useful. This meant the army couldn't live off the land. They were dependent on those supply wagons from Poland, but the supply wagons couldn't keep up because of the distance and terrible roads. Let's talk numbers to understand the scale. A soldier in Napoleon's army needed about 2 pounds of bread per day plus a pound of meat, plus some vegetables or dried beans. Call it 4 pounds of food total per man per day. For 600,000 men, that's 400,000 pounds of food per day. Every single day, that's 200 tons of food. Daily, you need hundreds of wagons just to carry 1 day's rations for the whole army. And remember, those wagons need weeks to make the round trip to supply depots. The horses were even worse. Each horse needed about 20 pounds of fodder daily, grain and hay. Napoleon brought about 200,000 horses. That's 4,000 pounds of horse feed needed per day. Another 2,000 tons. Daily. So we're talking about needing 3,200 tons of supplies delivered to the Army every single day just for basic food. The logistics are staggering. And that's before you consider ammunition, replacement equipment, medicine, all the other supplies an Army needs. The system started failing almost immediately. Within 3 weeks of crossing into Russia, the supply wagons were falling behind. The roads were too bad. Wagons got stuck in mud, wheels broke, horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers started going hungry. Not starving yet, but definitely not getting full rations. Officers began sending out foraging parties, small groups of soldiers who would scatter into the countryside searching for anything edible. This created a cascading problem. When soldiers leave the main column to forage, they're not with their units. Discipline breaks down. Some soldiers desert entirely, figuring their chances are better on their own. Some get lost and never find their way back to the army. Some get picked off by Russian cavalry or hostile peasants. So the army starts shrinking not from battle, but from disorganization. Units that started with 1,000 men arrive at the next camp with 800. Where did the other 200 go? Foraging, deserting, lost, dead. No one knows exactly. And the horses started dying in massive numbers. Remember 200,000 horses, each needing 20 pounds of feed daily. The feed wasn't arriving. The grass in Russia wasn't enough. Horses began collapsing from malnutrition and exhaustion. Within a month, 50,000 horses were dead. Dead horses meant abandoned wagons, which meant less carrying capacity, which meant even less food reaching the army. Another cascading failure. But the real killer wasn't hunger, it was disease. Armies in 1812 didn't understand germ theory. They didn't know that diseases were caused by microorganisms. They had no concept of proper sanitation. When you put 600,000 men together, marching through the same areas, drinking from the same water sources, living in close quarters, disease spreads like wildfire. The big killers were typhus and dysentery. Typhus is spread by lice, body lice, which thrive in dirty clothing and crowded conditions. Soldiers couldn't bathe regularly. They wore the same uniforms for weeks. Lice spread from man to man, and the lice carried typhus. Symptoms started with high fever, headache, confusion, then a rash. Then, for many victims, death within 2 weeks. There was no treatment. Once you had typhus, you either survived or you didn't. Dysentery came from contaminated water. When an army of 600,000 men camps near a river, what happens to the water downstream? It becomes contaminated with human waste. Soldiers would drink from streams without knowing that thousands of men had used those same streams as latrines upstream. Dysentery caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, weakness. In a healthy, well-fed person with access to clean water and rest, dysentery is survivable. But in malnourished soldiers marching 20 miles a day, it was often fatal. The medical system couldn't cope. French military medicine in 1812 was actually relatively advanced for the time. They had mobile field hospitals, trained surgeons, medical supplies, but the scale overwhelmed everything. Field hospitals were supposed to follow behind the advancing army, treating wounded and sick soldiers, then sending them back to their units once recovered. But the hospitals couldn't keep up. The sick and wounded accumulated faster than hospitals could process them. And the medical supplies, like food supplies, weren't arriving. Bandages, medicines, surgical instruments, they were all in those supply wagons stuck in mud 200 miles back. Soldiers who got sick often just got left behind. The army couldn't slow down for them. Officers would leave sick men in towns or villages, hoping they'd recover and catch up later. Most didn't. They either died or were captured by Russians. By the time the army reached Smolensk in August, 2 months into the campaign, Napoleon had lost about 150,000 men. Not from major battles. From disease, starvation, exhaustion, desertion, and disorganization. The army was disintegrating, but they kept marching toward Moscow. Because the core assumption still held: win a decisive battle, end the war, go home. All these logistical problems would be solved by victory. Except the decisive battle at Borodino in September didn't end the war, and taking Moscow didn't end the war. And suddenly Napoleon was sitting in a burning city 600 miles from his supply bases with a shrinking, sick, hungry army and no clear way forward. That's when things got truly catastrophic. If you're fascinated by how complex systems fail like this, a like on this video genuinely helps. It's a small thing, but it makes a difference for the channel. Now let's look at what happened during the retreat, because that's when the logistical collapse became complete. The retreat from Moscow started in mid-October. Napoleon had about 100,000 combat-ready troops left, out of the original 600,000. They began marching back toward Poland. The plan was to take a southern route through areas that hadn't been devastated during the advance, where hopefully they could find food. The Russians blocked that route. General Kutuzov's army shadowed the French and forced them back onto the same road they'd used during the advance. The road through burned towns and stripped countryside. This meant marching through areas where there was literally nothing to eat. The Russians had already taken or destroyed everything during the French advance. Now the French were retreating through the same wasteland. Starvation became the norm, not the exception. Soldiers were getting maybe one meal every 2 or 3 days, and that meal might be a handful of flour mixed with water or a piece of horse meat. Speaking of horses, they were all dying now. The remaining horses were weak from malnutrition during the advance. On the retreat, there was no fodder at all. Horses would collapse and die while pulling wagons. The wagons would be abandoned. More supplies lost. Soldiers began slaughtering horses for meat. The cavalry essentially ceased to exist because they had no horses. Artillery pieces had to be abandoned because there were no horses to pull them. When the horses ran out, soldiers ate whatever they could find. There are documented accounts of men eating leather belts, boiled in water to make them soft enough to chew, of soldiers fighting over scraps of rotten meat, of cannibalism, though historians debate how widespread that actually was. The army lost all organization. Units disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned their weapons because they were too heavy to carry. Officers lost control. It became a mob of starving men walking west, hoping to reach Poland before they died. Disease accelerated. Typhus was already widespread during the advance. On the retreat, it became pandemic. Men were packed together for warmth at night, sharing blankets, sharing lice. The disease spread through the entire army. Dysentery got worse too because sanitation completely collapsed. Sick men couldn't even leave the road to relieve themselves. They'd just stop walking, do what they needed to do, and try to keep moving. The road became a health nightmare, and then winter arrived in early November. Now there's a myth that the Russian winter destroyed Napoleon's army. That's not quite accurate. The army was already destroyed by disease and starvation before winter hit. But winter accelerated the final collapse. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Soldiers didn't have winter clothing. They'd been told they'd be home by autumn. Many had thrown away heavy coats during the advance to move faster and reduce weight. Men froze to death while sleeping. Frostbite destroyed hands, feet, noses, ears. Anyone who fell and couldn't get back up would freeze within hours. The weaker soldiers simply stopped being able to keep up with the main group, fell behind, and died. The Cossacks, Russian light cavalry, followed the retreat and picked off stragglers. They didn't attack the main column, that was still too dangerous. But anyone who wandered off or fell behind disappeared. Thousands of men just vanished. By late November, the retreat had become a horror show. Imagine a road covered with dead bodies, abandoned equipment, dying horses, and a thinning column of skeletal men in rags stumbling westward. That was the Grande Armée. The Berezina River crossing in late November was the final major crisis. The river should have been frozen solid, easy to cross on ice, but there'd been a thaw. The ice was broken. The bridges had been destroyed by Russians, and Russian armies were converging from multiple directions. French engineers built 2 temporary bridges while standing in freezing water that killed many of them from exposure. The army crossed under Russian artillery fire. The bridges collapsed multiple times. Thousands drowned. Thousands were left on the east bank when the bridges finally gave out completely. About 40,000 men made it across the Berezina, from 600,000 6 months earlier. The final 2 weeks of retreat were just a death march. Men kept dying from cold, disease, exhaustion. Units that had maintained some cohesion finally fell apart. By mid-December, when the remnants reached Poland, maybe $20,000 combat-ready soldiers remained. The rest? Dead, captured, or deserted. The horses were completely gone, all 200,000 of them. The artillery was gone. The supply wagons were gone. Everything was gone. So what does this catastrophe tell us about logistics and warfare? First, it shows that tactical brilliance means nothing if you can't feed your army. Napoleon was a genius tactician. He won battles that seemed impossible. But in Russia, he never got the chance to use those skills because his army dissolved before it could fight effectively. Second, it demonstrates the tyranny of distance. Napoleon's logistical system worked perfectly well at 300 miles. At 600 miles, it collapsed entirely. The math of supply lines is unforgiving. Past a certain distance, no amount of planning can overcome basic physical limitations. Third, it reveals how cascading failures work. One problem, supply wagons falling behind, led to soldiers foraging, which led to desertion and disorganization, which weakened units, which made disease spread faster, which meant more sick soldiers left behind, which meant smaller, weaker units. Each problem made the next problem worse. Fourth, it shows that disease, not combat, was the real killer in pre-modern warfare. This was true in most wars up until the 20th century. More soldiers died from typhus, dysentery, cholera, and other diseases than from enemy action. Logistics include sanitation and medical care, and Napoleon's system failed at both. And finally, it demonstrates that you can't separate military planning from logistical reality. Strategy must account for beans and bullets and horseshoes, not just troop movements and battle plans. The irony is that other commanders learned the wrong lessons from 1812. They saw Napoleon's defeat and concluded that invading Russia was impossible. What they should have learned was that logistics limits what's militarily feasible. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, they made remarkably similar mistakes. They planned for a quick campaign, didn't prepare for winter, underestimated distances, and watched their supply lines collapse. The technology was different, trucks instead of wagons, but the math of distance and supply remained unchanged. Modern military logistics is vastly more sophisticated, but the core lesson holds. Armies run on supplies, and supplies must actually reach the soldiers. The U.S. military famously spends enormous resources on logistics, understanding that getting ammunition and food and fuel to troops is what enables everything else. There's a military saying, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Napoleon's Russian campaign is Exhibit A for why that's true. We're almost at the end, but there's one more angle worth considering. What happened to those 20,000 survivors? Most were physically destroyed. Frostbite meant amputations, toes, fingers, sometimes entire feet or hands, removed by French military surgeons. Many men were permanently blinded by snow glare and malnutrition. Others were so weakened by disease that they never fully recovered. The survivors spent the winter of 1812-13 in military hospitals across Poland and Germany. French medical facilities were overwhelmed. Imagine tens of thousands of broken men arriving at hospitals designed for maybe a few thousand patients. And here's the darkest irony. 6 months later, Napoleon was asking these same men to fight again. By spring 1813, he'd raised a new army of fresh conscripts. But he needed experienced soldiers to stiffen the ranks. So survivors of the Russian campaign, men who'd barely lived through the worst disaster in military history, were sent back to war. Some did fight again. Some even survived to see Waterloo in 1815. But many couldn't. They were too physically or psychologically damaged. They'd watched 97% of their comrades die, and they never really recovered from witnessing that. The long-term health effects of the campaign were severe. Malnutrition, exposure, and disease caused problems that lasted decades. Many survivors died young from complications. They'd survived 1812, but they'd been permanently broken by it. The logistics of catastrophe didn't just destroy an army, it destroyed the lives of everyone who went through it. So that's the real story of Napoleon's Russian disaster. Not a tale of tactical defeats or strategic blunders, though there were plenty of both. It's a story of mathematics, of supply chains, of disease, of the brutal reality that armies need food and water and medicine. And you can't conquer a continent if you can't provide those things. 600,000 men marched into Russia believing the logistics would work because they'd always worked before. They were wrong, and that mistake killed almost all of them. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. This is a longer one and more technical than usual, but I think the logistical story needed to be told properly. If you found it interesting, subscribe to the channel. There's a new video every week exploring history from angles you might not have seen before. And drop a comment. I'm curious. Did you realize that disease and starvation, not combat, killed most of Napoleon's army? What other historical events would you like to see explained through the lens of logistics? There's a whole world of supply chain disasters throughout history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.